Thanks, Ben. Yes, the power of affirmation when we doubt ourselves. I'm just going to note this pulpit is also facing exactly this way, and so I do want to see you folks in the room. So if I ever look like slightly like a deer in the headlights, that's sort of what's going on behind the eyes here. But the power of affirmation, this power of affirmation when we doubt ourselves as parents or in so many ways, this is what I want to talk to you about today. And I want to start with a story about a time where I had a lot of doubts, and when I suspect many of us do, which is to say that I want to start with a story about high school. Now, I don't know about you all, but for me, high school was a really difficult, awkward time. There were lots of reasons for this. I was a fat kid, and I had all kinds of internalized fat phobia, and I suspect that I felt even more shame about my body than most children do, and most teenagers. I was also attending a private Catholic high school with a fairly conservative religious education program, one that was an all-boys school, and you can insert your air quotes here. Now, this was a bad fit for me because at the time I was an avowed atheist from a progressive family, where my parents were not only non-religious, but where they were openly critical of the Catholic Church and disdainful of their own Catholic upbringings. And finally, if you've been listening and you've heard those they, them pronouns, it was also queer. I was a non-binary person. I was a non-binary person who didn't even have the language to know what that was and to recognize that identity, my own identity. So this means, for those of you keeping track at home, this meant that I differed from most of my peers at that high school spiritually, politically, and genderly. I'm not sure if that last one's a word. And the result is that I ended up going through most of high school just feeling really isolated and pretty much assuming that my peers probably didn't like me very much. That is, however, until one day, one moment late in my senior year. But this moment, it happened in my senior year religion class, a class that was taught by the person who was perhaps most responsible for steering me towards ministry and towards spiritual leadership. And that person was Brother Kevin Dalmas, now of blessed memory. Brother Kevin's class was for me an introduction to so much of what we as Unitarian Universalists consider to be important about spirituality. Even though Brother Kevin was a devout Catholic and a Lasallian brother to boot, his class, it focused on things like the fact that community matters greatly for our spiritual lives, that spiritual growth requires honest, personal reflection on our deepest values, not simply trying to live into doctrine or dogma, and that we make a place holy by gathering together, joining our hearts with one another's, and caring for each other. And so for our final week of classes, Brother Kevin had us conclude our time together this year as we prepared to go into the world beyond high school by offering a blessing to one another. And this blessing, it came in the form of affirmation. Reflections from each student, for every single one of us, from each and every one of our classmates, about how they had experienced us during our time together that year. Now, I don't quite recall this detail, but I'm pretty sure that Brother Kevin had us volunteer for our turn to go, and I was dreading what my peers might say, so I waited as long as I could. I waited until I was one of maybe 2 or 3 students left. And then Brother Kevin looked at me with this look of loving challenge that so many of our spiritual teachers have mastered. And he goes, "Michael." And with a sigh, I begrudgingly said, fine, I'll go. And that's when something happened that really surprised my teenage self. One by one, my classmates, they began to generously affirm parts of who I had been in that class. They said some things that I was more or less expecting about me as a student. I was a nerd, and that came through. But they said some things that went beyond school too. They remarked on how compassionate I had been, how attuned I had been at times to the suffering of others, and how committed I was to making sure that voices that were not in that room were considered in our conversations, voices that are too often marginalized by society. And as these affirmations came in, as these more personal ones came in, I began to tear up. I cried tears of deep joy, of knowing that I was witnessed for who I was. I cried tears of knowing that, as you sometimes say, I was loved and lovable for who I was, not in spite of it. There is a quote by Maria Popova, who is an essayist, poet, and cultural critic, that I think speaks directly to this power of affirmation, this kind of witnessing. It's a quote that's often incorrectly attributed to James Baldwin. And so you might have seen it with that citation on social media. But this quote, it draws a connection between this kind of affirming those around us and the spiritual value and discipline that we as UUs have chosen to put at the center of our faith: love. Here's the quote from Maria Popova. "The longer I live," she writes, "the longer I live, the more deeply I learn that love, whether we call it friendship or family or romance, is the work of mirroring and magnifying each other's light." Love, the work of mirroring and magnifying each other's light. Now, I want to make one caveat here. By light, Popova, of course, doesn't intend to imply that only light is good, that there is nothing sacred about darkness. This is an idea that has been often used to foster racism and colorism. But rather, she's using this metaphor of light in the way that so many of us do, and as some of our hymns have already done today, as a shorthand for that part of us that is innately worthy, sacred, divine, that part of us that makes us us, that part of us that is so core to our being that some people and some traditions call it our soul. And though we just sang that song earlier, "Comfort me, oh my soul," we all know that there are times where we need others to comfort us because we have trouble recognizing our own inner light. That there are times where we need some help from others, just as I did in that high school class. And I know that I'm not the only one who's had that kind of experience. We heard from Ben about his earlier, but I suspect the two of us aren't the only two either. So I want to take a moment now to see just how many of us have been blessed by that gift of affirmation. How many of us have ever had someone reflect back our own innate blessings and goodness? How many of us have ever been affirmed, been reminded of a part of us that was good, but one that maybe we just doubted ourselves? How many of us have been affirmed even once? Go ahead and raise your hands. Yeah. For those of you who can't see, it's at least half the room, if not most. It's powerful, this kind of affirmation. It is powerful. It is so powerful that in her essay on this subject, Maria Popova goes on to call this work of affirming those around us gentle work, steadfast work, life-saving work in those moments when life and shame and sorrow occlude our own light from our view, but there is still a clear-eyed, loving person to beam it back. In our best moments, she writes, we are that person for another. In our best moments, we are that person for another. In our best moments, that's who we are. That's who we are as people. It's who we are as UUs, and it's who I suspect you all are as members of this congregation. And as Popova says, this work of affirming one another, of reflecting back another person's light, it can even be life-saving. But how? How can this work of cultivating loving relationships and affirming those around us be life-saving? Well, to answer that question, I want to look at the example of something that happened within our UU denomination, something that happened at last year, so 2024's General Assembly. And at General Assembly 2024, this is our national gathering where we gather to conduct business of the denomination. At that assembly, one of the major pieces of business was the passing of a resolution which states in its own language that embracing transgender, non-binary, intersex, and gender-diverse people is a fundamental expression of Unitarian Universalist religious values. This is to say that embracing people who exist beyond our society's narrow binary ideas about gender, about embracing people who don't necessarily fit in the land of this and that embracing intersex and trans folks broadly defined is a fundamental expression of our UU faith. Now, as you can imagine, this resolution, it came as a direct response to the wave of anti-trans legislation and rhetoric that was sweeping across the country at the time, and that has certainly not abated in the year since. For the most part, this resolution was a resounding success. It passed with almost 92% of the vote. And while that's not 100%, it is still something that is unheard of in our UU communities. When was the last time we had a 92% vote around here? But of course, 92% is not perfect, and the vote and the discussion, they weren't either. The mere act of putting this resolution up for a vote, it required delegates to discuss it. And what this ended up doing was making room for a small number of delegates to not only question the legitimacy of trans identities, but to spread misinformation, bad science, and even bigoted views about trans people. As a non-binary person watching that, as a non-binary person watching this discussion, which was in essence a debate about the very real existence and humanity of trans folks, it hurt. It really hurt. Since the UUA board had sponsored this resolution, the last word about it, it went to a member of the board, the Reverend Jacaren Olaoya, now the Reverend Jacaren Bell. Speaking spontaneously, extemporaneously, entirely from her heart, Reverend Jacaren offered a simple but powerful message. A message that would soon go viral in the small corner of the web populated by us UUs. And I want you all to hear that message in her own words. So we have a video of it, and we're going to play that now so you can hear it.
To my trans, non-binary, intersex, or gender diverse beloveds, lean in, lean in. I love you. I love you. I love you. Please do not leave this space without feeling my love and the love of others who see you as divine. I love you. You are divine. I love you. You are holy. I love you. You know who you are. I love you. You are worthy of being whoever you need to be to survive and thrive in this world. I love you, and I will say it for 50 seconds if I need to. I love you. 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 Do not leave this space without knowing that you are loved. If you are ever in doubt, call me, email me, text me, because what we will not do in this space is let you go another moment believing anything other than the fact that you are loved deeply just as you are. I love you. I love you. I love you.
So I want to spend some time lingering on that last line of Reverend Jacaran's testimony. That line that affirms the fact that all trans folks are loved. The fact that we are all loved, each and every one of us, for being who we are. Those of you who've been around for a while, you might recognize this as the central teaching of our Universalist heritage. That there is a power. Some call it God, some call it the universe, some call it a mystery. That there is a power that is always holding us, all of us, in love. And that because of that power, we are all destined for salvation, whatever that might mean. But here's the thing. It can be so easy to forget this fact, especially if you hold any kind of marginalized identity, as trans folks do, that is widely questioned, denigrated, even demonized. Over time, those messages, as well as the very real discrimination they inspire, they take a toll. They take a toll on a person's psyche and on a person's body. This is why the rates of self-harm and suicide are so high among trans and non-binary folks. And while I'm not going to read those stats because I want to take care of the trans folks we have in the room today, what I will say about them is that they drop drastically, especially for trans and non-binary youth, when trans and non-binary people have just one affirming adult in their lives. When that is true, those rates drop by anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2. Literally one person, one affirming person can save trans life. And hearing that, I can't help but think of Maria Popova's words. In our best moments, we are that person for another. In our best moments, we are that person for another. Look, and I'm speaking specifically to our cis folks, those who aren't trans in the room. I know that trans issues confuse a lot of us. I know that many of us grew up in the land of this and that, where when it came to gender, both and neither and somewhat and whatnot, they just weren't options. I know that many of us, myself very much included, we did not grow up with knowledge of trans issues or language about trans identities. I know that for many of us, we were taught that they, them, and theirs are plural pronouns, and it is hard to get used to referring to one person that way. I know that many of us, we worry about getting judged harshly for making a mistake on those pronouns or for using somebody's old dead name. I know all that. Remember, when I was in high school, I didn't even realize I was non-binary because I didn't have that language. Trust me, no one knows how hard any of this is more than trans and non-binary people. No one knows more than our gender diverse beloveds. But that's the thing. When it comes to affirming trans folks, it is always harder and hardest on trans people, and it is only made harder and hardest when in communities like this one, in Unitarian Universalism, we fall short of doing every single thing we can do to affirm trans folks and trans lives. And that's why I want to invite those of you who might have those worries or anxieties. When you feel those coming up because of something like pronouns or names or an issue you don't fully understand, I want to invite you to remember one of those moments when someone affirmed you. I want to invite you to remember how much joy sprung forth when that happened. when someone witnessed you as you were and as you could become, and affirmed that it was good and whole and holy. I want to invite you to remember that experience, and then realize how much it might mean to somebody else to do that for them, to be that person for another, to be that person who affirms something as basic as a non-binary person's gender or a trans person's name or identity. Things that are so core to who we are, and yet things that are so often mistaken and missed. Now, a few months ago, I might have ended this sermon there. I might have ended it simply with a call to affirm trans folks who are right in front of us, and to put aside whatever of our own baggage we need to do that. And we absolutely still have to do that work. And also, the reality is that today the United States is a very different place for trans people than it was even back in January, when it wasn't awesome, if we're being honest. And one of the trickle-down effects of this, one of the trickle-down effects of our current political climate is that trans folks, more than ever before, are moving to states where they have more legal protections and where the social and political climate is somewhat more safe. Trans folks are uprooting their lives, sometimes taking only the clothes on their backs or whatever they can fit into their cars, and moving to relatively safe states. Safe states like Colorado. The good news is that there are already organizations who are helping trans folks to relocate, not unlike an underground railroad for trans people. Nationally, there is a group called Pink Haven, and here in Colorado, there is a group called Transcontinental Pipeline. Right, trans folks, we got humor. The bad news, because there is always bad news these days, folks. The bad news is that these organizations are completely swamped and stretched past their limits. The needs and the demands for their assistance completely exceeding their capacity. And given that, and given all the other things we've talked about, given our faith's commitment to supporting trans and non-binary and intersex and gender diverse people, I think in this moment, in this time, we in our UU congregations need to be asking, how can we support that work that is already happening? How can we partner with and support those organizations that are already doing the work of relocating trans people and their families to places like Colorado? How can we prepare so that we are ready when trans folks show up on our doorstep, as they have already done at some of our congregations here, asking for assistance because they know our faith is committed to affirming trans folks? I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we put into action that liberating love that is at the center of our faith? My hope is that we choose to prioritize that work. And I would be delighted to talk to any of you who want to find ways to plug in or get connected. Because I want us as a faith to make good on our promises. I want us to live out that resolution that we adopted last year. I want us to affirm trans people and protect trans life by saying to trans and non-binary and gender diverse people, through both our words and our actions, as Reverend Karen so beautifully demonstrated, I love you. I love you. I love you. We love you. And what we will not do in this space, in this religious community in which we strive to put love at the center, is let you go believing anything other than the fact that you are loved. May this be so. May this be so, and amen.